welcome to Grasset Political Society's show. I'm your host, Marcus Rowland. On this episode, we will be covering President Donald Trump's tax returns and the campaign of Bernie Sanders. But to start with tonight, some news from Iran. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has announced that Iran is pulling out of certain parts of the Iran nuclear deal. First and foremost, he stated that Iranian uranium reserves would remain in Iran and that in 60 days they would begin enriching uranium again. The Iran nuclear deal was created to curb the potential for Iran to possess a nuclear bomb. The deal was going well until President Donald Trump pulled out of the deal and renewed sanctions. Iran has tried to work with the remaining partners, France, Germany, Russia, China, and the UK, but in face of mounting US sanctions, feels that it is no longer benefiting from the deal. Iran has not thrown the deal out the window. In fact, their foreign minister, Javad Zarif, claims that they are within the rights of the treaty and that they are willing to work with the remaining partners to reverse their decision. It just seems as if Iran needed to put pressure on those in the Iranian deal and hurry up the process for getting out of the sanctions. Now, on to other news. A recent New York Times article revealed a decade of President Donald Trump's tax returns. The shocking evidence is that between 1985 and 1994, Donald Trump paid taxes in only 2 years. How did he do it? He reports losses of over $1 billion in that period. In 1990 and 1991, he reported losses of $250 million a year. According to a study with the IRS, this is double that of the next highest annual loss. After being questioned about the rising issue, a lawyer for the president, Charles Harder, is quoted in saying that the tax information is highly inaccurate. On May 6th, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin refused a question by the chair of the House Committee for Donald Trump's tax returns for the president's tax returns. This is not surprising. The Democrats want Trump's taxes to be investigated for conflict of interest surrounding his businesses while he is president. The president flatly denies any such wrongdoing. The interesting thing is that Donald Trump campaigned on being a successful, wealthy businessman, and while he is wealthy, it is hard to look at him objectively as successful. He has lost more money than anyone else 2 years running, and he also lost, in a decade, $1.17 billion. I'd now like to turn to my panelists for some debate on Donald Trump's tax returns and the potential that this may have in upcoming election cycles. I'd like to welcome back our panelists. On the left, I have Calder and Nina, and on the right, Sean and Matt. So I'd like to open it up to anyone who wants to say anything about the president's tax returns that were recently released by the New York Times.
Well, I would like to say that the story that is told by these tax returns is nothing we haven't heard before. Trump, in fact, wrote a book about these losses in the 1980s called The Art of the Comeback, and it was part of his reputation of being a very good businessman and his ability to get himself out of tough situations where other people would have failed.
I mean, he still went bankrupt, but...
Yeah. What was it, 4 sexual allowance?
4 of his businesses went bankrupt out of several dozen businesses, yes.
So, is he really a brilliant businessman, though? I mean...
Yes, I would say he is.
The New York Times thing had him like, a billion?
$1.17 billion in losses between 1984 and 1995.
I feel like that's not really the mark of a good businessman as much as a failing one.
Well, a good businessman would be able to find out how to use tax loopholes to avoid paying income taxes, which he did successfully do with these losses. He avoided paying income taxes for much of the 80s and 90s. And he also did this while maintaining good investments both in the Trump Tower, or in the Empire State Building, and in many other businesses in New York City.
I mean, yeah, sure, he's invested, but I mean, not all of his investments go through. I feel like recently we had Trump Tower Moscow, and how'd that work out? Oh, Michael Cohen's in jail. Like, it's like, that's not directly related to his tax returns, but it's just not the mark of a good businessman when one of the major news stories of the last few months involved his poor business dealings. And also, 1.7 billion losses, that's not, like, is that really his tax loop that's lost him $1 billion?
Well, as Trump explained, I think this morning, many in the 1980s and 1990s, businessmen would report non-monetary losses to get deductions and major write-offs from the IRS, and it was all completely legal, and it gave Trump a big advantage while paying his taxes.
I mean, does that make him like a good businessman, or are you saying that it makes him like a intelligent, refined businessman?
Well, I think that using the tax system to its legal limit while also paying as little as possible is a good strategy if you wish to obtain or retain as much as your wealth as you can.
Something to add on to that. In 1990 and 1991, he reported losses of over $250 million each in those 2 years, and that was double the next highest deducted losses from businessmen in those time periods.
That doesn't seem like the mark of a good businessman.
Something people are pointing out to go off of that is he campaigned on his scheme of being a brilliant businessman and how he would call many people losers. Losing large amounts of money, I would say, is not a mark of a good businessman and is a mark of somebody who loses.
Well, if you look at Trump's business career start to finish, and outside of this small, outdated tax return, meanwhile keeping in mind the tax strategies he used to limit his payments to the government, Trump is a very successful businessman. He was the person that invested very heavily in Manhattan in the early 1980s, which was going through a recession at the time, and he was a part of the Reagan period of large economic growth that helped a lot of families in America. And he also...
You mean the wealthy families in
Well, in the
America?
1980s, economic growth was across all levels of income.
Yes, but it still widened the gap between the poor and the rich, as it has done.
This is why trickle-down economics doesn't work.
Yes, exactly.
Well, if everybody became richer by this, I would consider that working.
But it didn't. Okay, Matt. If a really poor person becomes 0.001% richer, and a really rich person becomes 45% richer, that's not. Oh yeah, they're both becoming rich. It's success, but it's not really a success.
Well, what we're seeing here, just during Trump's presidency, the median income, which is what economists use to avoid the average gap, you know, how many millionaires could bump up the average, they would use the median income instead. And what we're seeing here, the inflation-adjusted median income under Trump's presidency is higher than we've ever seen it in decades. It was higher than it was before the recession. So it's a good thing that Trump has brought the good deal-making and good financial sense that made him a successful businessman to the White House, and he's now making America a successful economy.
I just want to question something you said earlier. You commented on Trump being a businessman during the Reagan era of quote-unquote economic success. Are you saying that, in effect, by Trump being a businessman at that point, that makes him a good businessman? Like, I could look at you and say, oh yeah, you were alive during the recession. Does that make you a bad businessman?
I think that his business practices and his decision to invest very heavily into NYC helped revive the city, and also coincided with a great revival of America's economy after the stagflation of the late 1970s and early 1980s.
Are you aiding the entire fix of the recession to Trump?
Not necessarily, I'm saying.
I just think I want to comment on something that I've seen recently. Many people are talking about the economy, and obviously I'll give Trump credit. He hasn't managed to completely destroy it and annihilate it yet. And people often point as oh yeah, Trump's economy's been like this. But if here's the recession, it's been going up since Obama. So is Trump really being a great businessman and great with the economy? Is it really? He hasn't ruined it yet, but it's been going up since 2009. How does that give him any credit for being a good businessman? And I'll give him credit as he's not a absolutely terrible one, but he's not a good one.
Yeah, we saw the same thing with George H.W. Bush and Clinton with the surplus.
Well, if you look at statistics like job gains maybe, or unemployment rate, as the economy reaches full employment, job gains become more difficult to have. And as the economy gets bigger, percent GDP growth becomes harder and harder to maintain. So even though it looks like it may be the same, it's still surprising many people that we are still having a continued rate of growth that is going up and relatively low inflation for what should be occurring.
Also, during last December, didn't the Dow hit its lowest point since 2008, 2009?
No.
Oh, the December?
Yeah.
It was the lowest since the Great Depression.
Thank you. Yes.
You're welcome.
Since the Great Depression,
Yes.
the Dow Jones.
You're talking about it was either November or December,
It
the
was like
economy,
November,
right? It was
yeah,
the
it was
worst one
around-
on record
Well,
since
I
the
remember because I
Depression.
had to call.
While
Steve.
this is interesting, I'd like to bring it back to Trump's taxes
I
right
thought we
now,
got off topic.
because we've gotten a bit off topic. I'd like to know what people think as to why he hasn't personally released his taxes and why it took investigative journalism on the part of the New York Times to discover his tax returns.
I think he saw that 1.07 bill, or what was that? Was it
1.1.
1.1? Sorry, he saw that 1.1. He was like, "Oh my God, they can't see this. This is going to be awful for me as the president." So they tried to hide it. That's why he didn't release it when people originally were asking for his tax returns. Despite the fact that it's pretty customary. I was just reading all of the 2020 candidates releasing their tax returns. If he didn't really have something to hide, which we saw he kind of did. I mean, that's $1 billion loss. That's not good. So
But it's not illegal. But
yeah.
still, yeah.
It's not. It doesn't look good for him. So there's a reason he didn't release it, and I think that's not good.
Matt, what do you think?
Well, as I mentioned before, Trump often talked about the hole he experienced in the late 80s and early 90s, and even wrote a book about it called The Art of the Comeback, which came out in the 2000s. And also, I believe it was you who said that losing money was illegal. There's no law against losing money in your tax returns.
No, I know. I said it wasn't illegal.
Yeah.
I didn't say it was illegal. That's weird.
Specifically said it wasn't illegal.
Do you think now that we've seen his 1980s and early 1990s tax returns, the president will release the rest of his tax returns?
No.
No, I think that Congress is going to try to force it out of him, and he's not going to budge.
There's either two reasons he's not releasing it. One, he's just being petty, which I can respect, but it's just childish when you're a president and you need to show. And then two, he's hiding something.
I think that's the
So
more likely one.
yeah.
it's just-
Well, if you remember, President Trump was a businessman right before becoming president, and it's very likely that he will return to business after he leaves the office. And it is also notable that his businesses are still operating in a trust controlled by his sons, and the president's tax returns that were from before his presidency could be very useful to his competitors in either the real estate market or the hotel market or any other numerous business field that President Trump is involved in. And also, he has kept his promise to not release his tax returns after the audit ends. He's kept that promise so far, considering that they are still continuously under audit by the IRS.
So we're referring to the companies that are now controlled by Eric.
Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr., yes.
Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for in this segment. We're going to pivot on into our next one. Now onto our next topic, the campaign of Bernie Sanders. The current junior senator from Vermont is once again running for president. The 77-year-old candidate currently leads in the polls. He's built a large legacy of running on democratic socialism. During the last election cycle, he was the only major candidate to propose having Medicare for all or a universal health care system. Bernie Sanders is also running on a platform that contains College for All, where he plans to make public colleges and universities tuition-free. He also plans, like many other candidates, to significantly lower student debt. He also, like many other candidates, proposes higher taxes, especially when he refers to the 1%, which in reality would have to be more like the top 10 to 15%. Bernie Sanders plans on doing a lot of good, but one thing is certain, whatever he proposes will cost a large amount of money. His campaign is built on that of recently graduated college millennials. Now, however, Joe Biden has begun to slowly eat away at the senator's lead. Bernie Sanders has in the past run not to win the election, but to shift the Democratic Party in the direction he is hoping for. This election seems to be no different, although Bernie is doing much better than he had in the past. But it is still too early to see where the election will go. He could, in fact, end up winning the nomination. No matter what, though, this election cycle, especially for Democrats, is sure looking to be interesting. Welcome back to A World View. On this episode, we will be looking into Venezuela. People have been living in Venezuela for almost 13,000 years, but the modern history of Venezuela begins in 1498 with the arrival of Europeans. During his third voyage to the Americas, Christopher Columbus sailed near the Arauco Delta and landed in the Gulf of Paria. Amazed by the great offshore current of fresh water which deflected his course eastward, Columbus later expressed in a letter to Isabel and Ferdinand that he must have reached heaven on earth. Spain's colonization of the mainland of Venezuela started in 1522, establishing its first perimeter in South America settlement in present-day city of Cumana. In the 16th century, Venezuela was contracted as a concession by the King of Spain to the German Wessler banker family. Native leaders such as Guanquiparano and Tomacano attempted to resist Spanish incursions, but newcomers ultimately subdued them. In the 16th century, during the Spanish colonization, indigenous peoples, such as many of the Mariachis, themselves descendants of Calumna, converted to Roman Catholicism. Some of the resisting tribes or leaders are commemorated in place names, including Caracas, Chiranancos, and Locticos. These early colonial settlements focused on the northern coast, but in the mid-18th century, Spanish pushed further along the Orinoco River. After a series of unsuccessful uprisings, Venezuela, under the leadership of Francisco de Miranda, a Venezuelan marshal who had fought in the American and the French Revolution, declared independence as the First Republic of Venezuela on the 5th of July, 1811. This began the Venezuelan War of Independence. A devastating earthquake struck Caracas in 1812. Together with the rebellion of the Venezuelanos, helped bring down the republic. Simon Bolivar, new leader of the independence forces, launched his admirable campaign in 1813 from New Granada, retaking most of the territory and pronounced as El Liberador. A second Venezuelan republic was proclaimed on August the 7th, 1813, but only lasted a few months before being crushed at the hands of royalist Caudillo Jose Tomas Bove and his personal army of Llaneros. With a French invasion of mainland Spain in 1814, there was a push by expatriates to regain control over the colonial possessions. This did not work, and in 1817, Bolivar declared the Third Republic. The republic was short-lived, as only 2 years later, the Congress of Arangostra of 1819, it was decreed that the union of Venezuela and New Granada to form the Republic of Gran Colombia. The war continued for some years, until full victory and sovereignty were attained after Bolivar, aided by Jose Antonio Paez and Antonio Jose de Sucre, won the Battle of Carabobo on the 24th of June, 1821. On the 24th of July, 1823, Jose Purengico Pandilla and Rafael Andrade helped seal Venezuelan independence with their victory at the Battle of Lake Maracaibo. New Granada's Congress gave Bolivar control of the Grand Army. Leading it, he liberated several countries and founded Gran Colombia. This Venezuela lasted longer. With the declaration of the Monroe Doctrine by the U.S., it gave Venezuela some breathing room and allowed them to act as a nation. The discovery of massive oil deposits in Lake Maracaibo during the First World War proved to be pivotal for Venezuela and transformed the basis of its economy from a heavily dependent on agricultural exports to one of oil. It promoted an economic boom that lasted into the 1980s. By 1935, Venezuela's per capita gross domestic product was the highest in Latin America. President Gomez benefited handsomely from this, as corruption thrived, but at the same time, a new source of income helped him centralize Venezuela's state and develop its authority. In 1945, a military civilian coup overthrew Medina Agranita and ushered in a 3-year period of democratic rule from 1945 to 1948. Following 1948, a military dictatorship took control of the country. Venezuela remained a military state until 1958. Following the failed nation was a period of inharmonious democracy. The Bolivarian Revolution refers to a left-wing populism socialist movement and a political process in Venezuela by the late Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. who founded the Fifth Republic movement in 1997 and the United Socialist Party of Venezuela in 2007. In April of 2002, Chavez was briefly ousted from power in the 2002 Venezuelan coup d'etat attempt following popular demonstrations by his opponents. But he returned to power after 2 days as a result of demonstrations by pro-Chavez supporters in Caracas and action by the military. Chavez survived further political tests, including an August 2004 recall referendum. Chavez survived several further political tests, including an August 2004 recall referendum. He was elected for another term in December of 2006 and re-elected for a third term in October of 2012. However, he never swore in for his third period due to medical complications. Chavez died on the 5th of March 2013 after a nearly 2-year fight with cancer. The presidential election took place on Sunday, the 14th of April 2013, and was first since Chavez took office in 1999 in which his name did not appear on the ballot. Poverty and inflation began to increase in the 2010s. Nicolas Maduro was elected in 2013 after the death of Chavez. Chavez picked Maduro as his successor and appointed him vice president in 2013. Maduro was elected president in a short-handed election in 2013 following Chavez's death. In 2017, Venezuela experienced a constitutional crisis. In March of 2017, oppositional leaders branded Nicolas Maduro a dictator after Maduro aligned the Supreme Court tribunal, which had been overturning most National Assembly decisions since the opposition took control of the body. The Supreme Tribunal took control over most of the functions of the Assembly, pushing a lengthy political standoff to new heights. However, the Supreme Court quickly backed down and reversed its decision on the 1st of April 2017. A month later, President Maduro announced the Venezuelan Constituent Assembly election. On the 30th of August 2017, the 2017 Constitutional National Assembly was elected into office and quickly stripped the National Assembly of its powers. In December of 2017, President Maduro declared that the leading opposition parties will be barred from partaking in next year's political vote after they boycotted mayoral polls. Maduro won the 2018 election with 67.8% of the vote. The result was challenged by countries including Argentina, Chile, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, France, and the United States, who deemed it fraudulent and moved to recognize Juan Guaido as president. Other countries, including Cuba, China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, have continued to recognize Maduro as president. Although China, facing financial pressures from its position, has reportedly begun hedging its position and decreasing loans given, canceling joint ventures, and signaling willingness with all parties. A Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokeswoman denied the reports, describing them as false information. The Cubans have provided personal protection to President Maduro, and the Russians are also providing intelligence officers and other such methods of protection. The current crisis in Venezuela shows no signs of slowing down, but hopefully for the people's sake, it will. That is unfortunately all the time we have for this episode. I will see you next time.